Welcome to the Grace Space, a transmission for the sovereign soul. Hey everyone, real quick before we begin, if this content matters to you, you're warmly invited to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to leave a comment, or all three. I read all the comments, and your engagement is really important because when you engage, it tells YouTube to push this content out to more people who would find value in it. Now that I understand this, I engage a lot more with the channels that are important to me because I know it really matters. Thanks for listening. Here we go. Hi, everyone. You know, there's a lot being revealed right now. It's information, it's history, true history, motives, technologies, power structures. We're starting to see behind the veil. And yet, you know, as more is revealed externally, it's like many people feel more confused internally. Not because they're incapable of understanding, but because revelation without inner orientation can be destabilizing. So I want to pause here, not to explain what's happening in the world. That's not my job. I can't do that. But to ask something more fundamental. What does it actually take to meet this collective moment on our planet as an adult human being? Because there came a moment for me where I was like, have I actually stepped into real, true adulthood? What does that even mean? Lately, I've been contemplating sovereignty, as I often do, not as a concept, but and not as a movement, not as something you declare, but what it means as a lived internal reality. And what I keep returning to is this: sovereignty is not established by external acts, it is revealed by internal coherence. It happens naturally when you get to a certain place. Before it becomes visible in the world, it exists as a quiet knowing of who you are. You make no more apology for who you are. And I'm not talking about the ego persona that's so carefully crafted to compensate for our fears and our wounding and our past. I'm not talking about the ego persona that wants to impress, to try to be someone in the world. This is not the you that you're trying to be. This is not the you that you feel compelled to defend. It's not the you that you hope others will recognize. It's the you that you are when there's no authority to appeal to. And this is where we begin touching on something much deeper. Sovereignty is not only a mindset upgrade. I mean, it is definitely that. It's about breaking out of mental prisons. But even deeper than that, it is a biological and generational unlearning. Because the conditioning that we're speaking about, the programming that I'm always talking about, all of this stuff is not only psychological or cultural, it is generational. It is inherited. It has moved into the body itself. We need to deeply realize this. Kathy O'Brien, in her book, Transformation of America, which I highly recommend, you need a strong stomach to get through it. She spoke to this reality in her own way, pointing to the fact that when trauma moves through multiple generations, it eventually stops being remembered as trauma and it begins to feel like just the way things are. It's just nature. It's just your identity. In other words, after several generations, inherited trauma stops being remembered and it starts being literally embodied. It becomes part of you. For countless generations, we human beings have been taught explicitly and implicitly that we are indebted, inferior, sinful, unworthy, and fundamentally lacking. We have a very poor image of ourselves. What do you think? Do you agree with that? That's what I see when I look around. We believe that something is wrong with us that has to be managed, corrected, redeemed, overseen. And over time, that message doesn't just shape our belief, it shapes our biology. Now, I know there's a lot of seeming evidence out there when you look at the state of the world that there's something wrong with humans. But I want to suggest something very different here. What if what we are witnessing is not a proof of our inherent corruption, but the result of long-term deformation, deformation? We have been deformed. What if humanity has been deliberately shaped over many generations, I would even say over thousands of years, into fragmentation, dissociation, and internal conflict precisely so we never see the hidden hand at work? When a being is kept in a constant state of fear, scarcity, and inner division, it doesn't need to be ruled overtly. It will police itself. We saw that during the pandemic. It will fight its neighbors. It will defend the very structures that dominate it. There's a name in psychology for this phenomenon. When a captive begins to identify with, bond with, and even defend their captor, right? They call it Stockholm syndrome. It's a survival response, not a moral failure. And on a collective level, this is one of the deepest spells that we are breaking. As long as we are encouraged to hold a fundamentally negative view of ourselves, right? Humans are flawed, violent, sinful, unworthy, inferior. We will never reclaim our power because you cannot restore sovereignty to a being that has been taught to despise its own nature. And think of all the different vectors through which we have been taught this, explicitly and implicitly. They are many. Restoring our sovereignty requires something radical. The restoration of our true sense of who we are, not as broken creatures, not as problems to be managed, not as a plague on the planet, but as capable, conscious, relational beings whose humanity was never the flaw. It was the threat, the greatest threat to the systems of control and domination that we were born into that have kept this kind of programming and conditioning going and that are now being revealed as the veil thins. The disempowerment that we were subjected to over generations has been patterned now into the nervous system, into the stress response, into the gut, into the immune system, into what our bodies expect from life. This is why sovereignty is not only spiritual or mental realization, it is that too. But it is also a process of detoxification, not just of substances, but of spells. Many of us carry parasitical overlays that are not simply physical organisms, but inherited programs that prey on our vitality. Loops, right? You know the loop that you get caught in. Loops of fear, of shame, self-betrayal, and submission. Submission that repeat themselves until they are consciously interrupted. In older language, these were called curses. Stories and patterns handed down generation after generation until someone becomes willing to stop the transmission. So, sovereignty also involves a kind of biological reclamation because these spells, these curses have been so embedded in our system, in our vessel, in our being, our biological being. It requires a breaking of chains that were never chosen. It requires a release of loyalties that no longer serve life. You know, I see now that this one of the reasons I became a natural health coach long before I could articulate it this way. Unconsciously, I think I was responding to that need to get out of us what we never asked to have put in there, right? Because healing and detoxifying the body is also breaking the spell, deprogramming us, breaking the invisible chains that have bound us. You find this out pretty quickly when you go through a real detoxification, a real cleanse, or a fast, or something like that. You find out really fast what your emotional allegiances are to. It's a great way to deprogram you from your habits and your unexamined assumptions about food, about family, about the rhythms of eating. And anyway, I'm going off on a tangent there. But as these layers clear, something amazing happens. The body itself begins to remember what the mind alone cannot restore. It's not a mental process, this setting ourselves free, sovereignty. It's not the mind alone, it's the whole being because we are multidimensional. And we start to find again dignity in our humanity, orientation in the cosmos. Like, where do we come from? Who are we? What are we doing here? Where are we going? Also, the capacity for self-determination. Sovereignty returns not as an idea, but as a lived, embodied truth, and you can feel it. You can feel it in your bones. And it feels true and it feels right. And you start to realize, oh, I was always supposed to feel this way. I mean, this is much closer to my true and natural state. So I find that disclosure is forcing this question. We often think of disclosure as information coming out. I've been saying again and again that the true disclosure is not about information and what's been kept from us, coming to light. Disclosure is the revelation of who we are, we human beings, who we are, and why we've been so suppressed. And in order for us to accept the grandeur of who we really are, because it really is so grand, we have a lot of deliberately imposed programming to shed. So, in this sense, disclosure exposes something else, our dependence on external authority. This is something that's really been bred into us. I guess that's why we so appreciate the archetype of the rebel or the maverick, right? Because we want to activate that part of ourselves. When familiar structures lose credibility, as they are every single day, it seems like now, when narratives contradict each other, right? Hard to tell what's real and what's not. When even well-intentioned guidance feels unreliable, we're confronted with an uncomfortable truth. At some point, no one else can decide for us. We have to have an inner compass that works. We have to be connected to the heart, not the mind. The mind is not going to tell us the truth. The heart will. But of course, the heart has been suppressed. So a lot of us are learning how to reconnect to our heart. This moment may feel like a crisis, but actually it's a developmental threshold. Human adulthood, real adulthood, begins when we can orient ourselves without outsourcing our authority. You've got to back yourself. Many people talk about sovereignty. Fewer are willing to notice where they're not yet ready to live it. Not because they're weak, but because conditioning runs really deep. We have been trained subtly and repeatedly to believe someone else knows better, someone else is the boss, someone else is responsible, someone else will carry the consequence. And that training doesn't just disappear because we learn a new language. Sovereignty is not rebellion, it is maturity. And maturity requires honesty. This is not an episode on how to be sovereign. It's more of an invitation to notice the areas where we're not yet standing fully in our sovereignty. If you ask yourself a few questions like, where am I still asking for permission? Where am I still looking for reassurance? Where do I secretly hope that someone else will take responsibility for the outcome of my life? These are not failures. They're just places where our development paused, where we remain children, not truly competent to handle our own affairs. You know, we have a history of being subjugated, subjected, subservient. Sub meaning underneath, right? It takes a lot of courage to admit that we've been operating that way. The ego doesn't like it. Nobody's going to be the boss of me. What does that really, I mean, when you ask yourself the question, really, all bark and no bite, the soul knows it is meant to operate under its own authority, not someone else's. There's something else that we need to gently name here. Something that happened to all of us so early that we don't even remember it as an event. But it marked us. And it's not a single moment, but it was a passage, a crossing from the world of the womb into the world that we live in now. It was a separation from our original sense of being spiritual, self-directed beings. You know, in the old stories, this is never explained as bureaucracy or policy. It's told as a spell of forgetting, a bargain that was made without our consent, a name that was taken, a child that was placed under guardianship. Think about the fairy tales that we all grew up with. You know, the true heir hidden at birth, the infant swapped in the night, the kingdom that falls asleep under an enchantment, the prince or the princess who were raised believing that they are ordinary or they're abused or treated like inferiors until the spell begins to break. These stories, they persist because they are carriers of our memory. And they talk about a fall from grace that was not caused by sin, but by separation, right? You know, in the Bible, they talk about being born into sin. That's not because we are inherently sinful. We are born into a world that is sinful, right? In other words, inverted, upside down. The fall from grace is the separation from our true spiritual nature, the forgetting of it, by being told implicitly and explicitly and repeatedly that we are not yet capable, that we are not yet authorized, that we are not yet ready, that we are not yet sovereign. And this is the first major trauma. It's not violent, it's not dramatic, it happens without a sound, but it's profound. It's a quiet spell that teaches us to look outside ourselves for permission, for protection, for identity. How many people, when you ask them who they are, will tell you a story about their name and their family and what they do? But that's not who we are. See, this spell works best when it goes unnamed. Most people are still living under this spell, and many will defend the reality that it sustains vigorously, and you better not get in their way. I had an experience the other day that knocked my socks off as somebody who was really eager and vociferously defended the matrix that she was a part of. But what we're witnessing now through these waves of revelation that are continuously breaking on the shore, the confusion, the collapse of so many structures, it's not simply the systems failing, it's the spell wearing thin, the veil, right? People aren't just questioning institutions, they're questioning the story of who they were told they are. This is amazing. And that questioning can feel disorienting because waking up from a spell always does. You're like, where was I? What happened to me? Where have I been? I know that's how I have felt. So we're standing at a threshold here and we have a choice. Do you choose to stay asleep or do you choose to remember who you are now? Because we're living in a moment where non-choice is no longer neutral. Not because something bad will happen if you don't choose, but because choosing not to choose is still placing your life in somebody else's hands. Self-determination does not begin with action. It begins with willingness to do a clear-eyed assessment of your true status. Do you have your own back? really and truly? Do you know who you are? Self-determination requires a willingness to govern your own inner life, to master yourself, which is a prerequisite for governing your outer life. The time is coming where we will have to back ourselves. I was told a story recently by a colleague that I really admire. He found himself in the presence of, let's just say, forces that regarded humanity as lesser, unsophisticated, unaware, easily dismissed. And instead of posturing or pushing back with aggression, he did something far more powerful. He stood fully inside his humanity. He knows who he is. He knows what the earth is. He knows what the sun is. He was oriented in the cosmos, aware of the nature of reality, the true nature of reality, and unashamed of his place within it. In fact, he knew that being human was his superpower. He's not ashamed of his humanity. And that knowing was unmistakable. It was recognized by those other beings. The moment it became clear that he was not ignorant, that he was not asleep, that he was not operating from a sense of inferiority, the dynamic shifted. And what had been dismissive became suddenly cautious, right? What had been condescending became restrained. Suddenly you're like, oh, this guy knows who he is. We can't pull the wool over his eyes. Not because he demanded respect, but because his own self-recognition made denial of that impossible. This is important. We don't need to be belligerent. We don't need to bark or posture or dominate. We just need to be ourselves and stop nourishing the idea that we are lesser than any other being in existence. And I mean any other being in existence. You think the angels are above you? You think the ascended masters are above you? No. We are inferior to no one in our true nature when we know who we are. Backing ourselves doesn't mean fighting. It means knowing in your bones who you are. A full universal fractal of the source. And knowing quietly, unmistakably, what that means. So, nothing that I've spoken about today requires you to do anything. There's no application, there's no declaration, there's no next step here. It's only a noticing, right? How am I inside? Who are you when no one is watching? Are you willing to meet yourself there? Do you know who you are? Where you came from, where you are, where you're going? And I'm not talking about the details of your life and the persona. I'm not talking about your biography or your resume. As a being, do you know who you are in the real? Do you know your place in the universe? And even if you don't yet, are you willing to back yourself? What must be internally resolved before your sovereignty can move into form? These are questions that we have to answer for ourselves. Well, and I really hope that this season of the grace space will give you some context that can help. Thanks for listening today. Thanks for staying till the end. I'll see you again soon. Meanwhile, walk in grace. You've been listening to The Grace Space. To amplify this field, you're welcome to like, subscribe, or share. Thank you.